you all will enjoy this session, here. So just to quickly give you who all we have as part of our lead discussions, I'm really happy to have Michael from Bitspan, we have Emily from Brookings, we have Avril from Deaf and Phillips, we have Richard from Godera, and we have Tim from Duke. Some of us, would like to bring out specific perspectives about different myths. So let's just sort of dig right into it. And with each of these myths, I would also open it up to the room so that you can also talk about your experiences and what you have learned. So yeah, I think the first one we wanted to talk about is that is impact and business and operations insights, are these like really mutually exclusive? Like, is this a big question about like impact being different and like, business insights and outcomes and those things are being very different? I would love to like start with Emily, if you can just, share some of your thoughts around that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Good afternoon. So impacts and business insights. I guess I like to think about this. So just to give you a background to who I am and kind of the hat that I'm wearing as I respond to this. So one, I'm an economist, and I've spent many years doing impact evaluation work. So I think of this sort of from that perspective. And the other hat I wear is that I've been development impact bonds for the last 4 years, which is a particular type of impact investing and particularly focused, I think, on impact. So those are sort of the two sides that I bring, or two angles that I bring to this discussion. About that question, I think that what really we should start off with is kind of what's the theory of change when we're thinking about impact, and I like to think about it kind of from two things. One, it's the what you measure, and two, how you measure. So on the what you measure, I often say that what we want to be measuring things that are meaningful, things that we care about, right? Things that are measurable, and things that are malleable, meaning actionable, or that something can actually be done about them. And I think taking those three words, I think that really fits into kind of the idea of business insights, right? What can we learn from what it is that we're doing? The other piece is around how you measure. And that's really kind of what are the tools that you're using? And those types of tools may impact the types of insights that you're able to get. And then two, evaluation, the methods of evaluation. I think that on the methods of evaluation part, the insights really depend on the rigor of the evaluation methodology. And so, it sort of depends on what question you're trying to answer and how you envision this theory of change. I think I'll pause there and let my colleagues respond, and then we'll maybe come back.
I mean, I would love, Michael, if you can talk a bit about how do you see this, because you consult with so many different organizations. How do you see, is this something which organizations see as two different things? If not, or if yes, can you just give an example where you have, seen this question come up, or how you've answered that?
Absolutely. Pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And headline, I'll say the answer is no. These are the same thing. I'll explain what my context is on that first, but I think it is clear that when we make them separate, we make impact less important, and we make it a secondary consideration to our financial and business metrics. And so the lens that we really bring to this is the lens of decision making. That's where we see this as the very first step of impact coming into the process. If you are an entrepreneur, or if you are a holder of capital, if you aren't at the time of investment, the time of allocation of capital, thinking about how your impact and financial performance will be managed and measured, it's already too late. And so that's why I just give a very clear yes to the starting question. And that perspective comes from my professional work at Bridgespan, where we are an advisor to both holders of capital and seekers of capital across the returns continuum, to borrow the phrase from our Omidyar colleagues. With roots in philanthropy, we're increasingly working with both families and large private equity firms like Texas Pacific Group's Rise Fund, Bain Capital's Double Impact, on exactly these sets of questions. So to make that a little bit more concrete, I could pick on one of the investments from Texas Pacific Group's Rise Fund and the Dodla Dairy story, where going beyond the traditional business measures for a dairy company into the specific accountability of the prices paid to farmers, the volumes distributed in wet and dry seasons, and asking just a couple more questions on top of the core management dashboard that was created for an investment like that makes it one conversation. It's a conversation about the overall performance of the business that now, in a much more nuanced way, can start to take into consideration what are the impacts of that business on the livelihoods of those farmers that are their supply chain. So a both and rather than an either or kind of approach that helps make better decisions on every day how the leaders of that business allocate their time, capital, and scarce resources.
Thank you. So I think it's a very interesting point which you brought up, the fact that some of the KPIs which are going back into the MISs, or if you don't collect and merge those data points together, I think it's very difficult to have those discussions at a board level or at a level where actual decisions are being made. So having said that, I think, Rich, I would sort of turn to you, and I would like to understand how is Goodera enabling some of this with the technology which you are bringing in, and sort of merging these things about impact and business insights together with the kind of clientele you serve.
So, I've been discussing, the topic of impact and business. Actually, it's all integrated. It's about how soon you realize it, right? So corporates have started realizing that it's no more just single bottom line. It has to be triple bottom line. You have to take care of the people and the planet as well while you're looking at, business as such, your profits, for the business to be sustainable in long term. One thing that has happened is, at least now at the board level, people have started realizing that the capital that they're investing in development work across their supply chains, across their value chains, it's not a quarter-on-quarter return. It's not, you're looking at hardcore financial numbers or financial returns. It has to be patient capital, but at the same time, what is happening with your capital needs to be known. There needs to be transparency and efficiency in the ecosystem, and that's why the KPIs are becoming more and more important, and something which can then be translated into what the board can make a sense out of, right? Because when we are doing work on the ground, there are hardcore KPIs and metrics, that definitely, from a development lens perspective, you need to monitor, you need to track. But then, for the businesses to be aligned and to get that kind of support, at the board level, you need to be able to actually translate and merge that into numbers and into terms that the board can appreciate, right? So that evangelism, or, that is equally required, wherein, both parties can come together and have an understanding of what's happening on the ground versus what gets discussed at the board level. And that's precisely, what we are trying to do through our technology platform, wherein all the NGOs who work with large corporates, input information with regards to their performance against the key performance indicators, which can actually translate into how the progress is happening with regards to timeliness and what's the health of the project. And what we try and provide insights at the board level is how it is affecting the business in the long run, because ultimately, all this, it's strategic CSR. As a business, we are not there to do philanthropy. It is strategic CSR. There is no harm in saying that, we do good, but at the same time, we make business sense as well, and we do good business as well. So, what we are trying to do is we are trying to translate these metrics which can then be showcased as something which convinces the board that if we do this, this is how my business is going to be sustainable over the long term. So that's how we're doing it.
Thank you, Richa. So before I turn to Tim and Avril, I would just like to see if anybody in the room has an opposing view who thinks that, like impact data or insights are actually very different, and like business operations data are very different, so, or they don't come in together. So is there anybody who feels that way or has examples to share from their organizations or work? Okay. Great. We'll come back to that. So, Tim, I think one of the things we discussed, and I think you mentioned, was around the fact that how they're known as a company, and I think you were trying.
Myself to the room. My name is Timothy Yoon. I am a business school student at Duke Fuqua. I've been part of the CASE program, which is a social entrepreneurship focused institution, part of Duke Fuqua. Kathy Clark, our director, is actually here in the room as well. And one of the things that we've done over this past year is our team had worked with IIC to look into impact investing in India. What are some of the best practices? And so out of this research was some of this conversation about, do businesses actually see the rate of return as the same as social impact, or are they held in the same regard? We know, surveying IIC members, that roughly 2/3 of them already believe, yes, we think so, that we value them the same. And 90% of them actually record impact or measure impact in some way. A recent GIN management survey also found very similar too. It found that 3/4 of respondents said, yes, we believe they're the same. So the Danone example that we're bringing up, so Danone, a multinational food company, recently has actually been able to negotiate with 12 different banks a lower cost of capital based on a percentage of sales from its subsidiaries that are B Corp certified. And so this is an example of people outside of this room, right? We're not preaching to the choir. These are companies that are recognizing that there are actual immediate financial benefits and social benefits that can come out from focusing on these things and using impact measurement.
Great. Let me introduce myself. I'm Avril Jain, Managing Director with Duff & Phelps. Possibly the, I would say the odd one out, because I come from a financial advisory background more than the, the social investments background. But still related, still connected to IIC. Why? Because I think the journey started around 5 years back, where one of the largest education foundations reached out to us, and they wanted us to carry out. They were in the process of fundraising. They came to us and they wanted us to develop a business plan, et cetera, which is obviously more like a bread and butter business for us. But more importantly, they wanted us to also show the social impact of the project they were running. And at that juncture, I think we did some research, we got some frameworks, etc. But at the end, we concluded that, we are not yet evolved, to put certain numbers to these social impacts. Because there are many frameworks which have qualitative sort of indicators. One can evaluate them, measure them, but eventually to convert them into some sort of a mathematical number which talks about the social value the project has created is definitely challenging. So in the last 1 year or so, I think we've been trying to test out various frameworks which takes care of the expectations of the project implementer and also eventually the stakeholders, whether you look at the investors or the government. And obviously there are certain additional topics which we have to discuss, so I'll not jump into the framework itself. But I'd like to bring about another perspective to this whole discussion, is that from a CSR perspective in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in India is very, very active in this area. I see a lot of participants coming from outside India traveling for this event. You may be aware or not be aware, there is a certain percentage of CSR spending which is being mandated by the ministry to be spent on this sector on an annual basis for all listed companies, which is really leading to a big sort of expenditure coming in this sector. We are talking about billions of dollars which have to be spent on this. And what it means is that it also raises the requirements of accountability. One is obviously evaluation and measurement, but also the accountability. And that's where, the frameworks, etc., will come into picture.
Thank you, Tim and Abdul. I think one of the interesting things and why we wanted to bring out this myth here was that some of the folks here in this room or even in the sector are pretty much at the beginning of their journeys. To some people who have been in this for decades, I think there is always that question of like, how does impact, like how much do I put my resources into like understanding impact versus like how much resources am I putting in to understand the business? And I think we collectively, we felt that it's not very different, so it should not be like one versus the other. And that takes us segueing into the second myth, which is around like, is impact management and measurement very expensive? So I think before I sort of, open it up to, our lead panelist here, I would love to hear, yeah, sure, Anil, I think I would love to hear from you. Sorry, Anil, we are just getting the microphone. Give us a second. It's very interesting to hear from Anil because I've worked very closely with him on when he was with IFC on building frameworks. So yeah, I'm really interested to hear.
No, thanks, and I think this is the
Okay, lovely.
yeah. No, thanks. So I think your first point relates to making the business case for impact measurement. So Jin did a study in 2016, and it's publicly available, on the business value of impact measurement. And one, and secondly, case studies from different corporations that have used this for good effect, and business value both in terms of direct business, sales, et cetera, as well as indirect benefits that increase the overall viability of that corporation in the longer term. And I think that those two pieces could be useful. And here's something to think about. Could we think of something similar for India? I think we have enough experience. I think let's bring out some of our own homegrown experiences in this, and I think everything has to be contextual. I can drill down further, but I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Anybody else? If you can start with also saying, do you feel like it's very expensive or not?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful because Anil and I have worked very closely. My name is Eriko Ishikawa. I'm from the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. We focus on the private sector. So I'm actually going to answer both number one and number two. Okay, number one. We started this small group called Inclusive Business in 2008, but I went back all the way to 2005. So we looked at every project that went to the board, just through our board reports, and really looked at the ones that had that impact on low-income populations, either buying from smallholder farmers or really doing, microfinance and all kinds of services for the poor. And there is this myth that that portfolio or sub-portfolio would not be as well-performing as the rest. It turns out that on the debt side, we do exactly the same as the ones that are not targeting the poor. And on the equity side, we actually did better. So this is really ex post looking at what we have already booked. And now we have a whole ex ante way of any project that goes to the board has to put down exactly what impacts we expect, and inclusion is one of them. So number one, really targeting impact does not cost more in terms of, you're not going to make as much money. It turns out it's the same. Well, having said that, every single project that we do goes through environmental, social, and governance, ESG type things, so they all have to be the same. They have to be financially viable. But in addition, the ones that targeted the poor did not do worse. So myth number one, it is doable. Myth number two, this is a little more difficult. Because we had done all that work, we were able to issue a social bond under the IFC name. And I just found out that she actually bought some, so I was really so excited.
That's a great point around the bonds, and I think
Yes.
Especially with respect to impact management and like measuring impact.
Yes, and
For
I'm
bonds.
gonna give you a little heads up because next week at the IMF World Bank meeting. IFC, with others, will be talking about impact measurement principles. And this is something that I think we all have to keep in mind. And I'm really glad that Emily started talking about theory of change, because all of us in here know what it is. We know that it's, you know, input, output, outcome, impact. And that impact means something to all of us here.
Sure.
But impact in the outside world, they confuse it with other things. But because impact is being used by so many people, I think IFC and others have come to the realization that if we're going to really talk about impact, let's have some principles. And we've worked on the principles for the green bond and the social bond. So on the debt side, there are principles, and the International Capital Markets Association have approved them. So we have to build something else for the funds and for all the people that are doing impact work. But it is expensive. It is not cheap.
Okay, so you feel it's expensive. So I think I would like, Emily, if you can talk a little bit about like how these impact bonds which are coming up now, like how expensive, or like even talk about like is the management of looking at the outcomes of these bonds or how these payments are being done? Like how does this all relate back to the financials?
Sure. Can I answer the other question first quickly, and then we'll get to the impact bonds piece. So I think, again, when it comes to, I mean, first of all, I think sort of what, to some extent, people were saying that there's a bit of a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done, and perhaps those benefits can sometimes be very challenging to measure because they can be, you know, longer than the period of time that you're actually looking at in, you know, for a particular project or something, and may have much broader benefits to society, et cetera. So that's one thing. The other is that when you're talking about measuring, back to this concept of sort of what you measure and how you measure, you know, if you're measuring inputs, so you have kind of going from inputs to process to outputs, quality, outcomes, impact, probably the farther you get to your right, my left, likely the more expensive it will be. And I think that a really important thing to take into consideration is that you may not always need to measure outcomes in a particular case. Say, for example, vaccinating children. You know, if you've put that vaccine in the arm that they're vaccinated, you don't need to measure that they're immunized. So that's something to take into consideration when it comes to sort of the what you're measuring. On the how you're measuring, and this is something that sort of, and this will kind of segue into the impact bond piece, you know, the more rigorous your evaluation is, the more expensive it can be because you need to identify a control group, et cetera. And also kind of depending on the kinds of tools you're measuring, and that relates to what kind of outcomes you're measuring. But there are also some aspects of that I think that are important to take into consideration, is whether there may be data that are already being collected that could be utilized, for example. So that's sort of the source of the data is another variable in that equation of cost. So on to impact bonds. So impact bonds are sort of I would say that the impact is bigger in impact bonds in terms of measurement than generally in the impact investing sector. That doesn't mean that they have greater impact, but what we generally are seeing in impact bonds is that outcomes rather than there's a shift from a focus to inputs, there's a shift from a focus on inputs to outcomes. And so when we look, for example, at all of the impact bonds around the world, the majority of them are actually measuring outcomes. So 56% of impact bonds that have been contracted are measuring outcomes. About 38% are measuring both outputs and outcomes. And only 6% are measuring only outputs. So that's just an interesting sort of perspective of, you know, how do impact bonds perhaps compare to, and I don't know what the statistics look like in impact investing more broadly, but, and also remember impact bonds represent a very small portion of the impact investing, market, but just interesting as impact bond market is growing, you know, sort of what are some of the shifts and maybe some of the things that can be learned and spread across. So, was there another question on the impact bond side? Yeah. Yeah.
So I think just over to you, Michael. So I think if you can just talk about these differences, right? Like how much is too much in terms of spending money on understanding impact? Like, can you give examples of like where you've seen very swift measurement, which is also being able to, I don't know, like any example of that, or somebody whom you had to like push and say that, you know, no, I think you need to put in more money to measure. So I don't know if you have any examples around that, that would be great to hear.
Sure, so I think I do pick up a bit from where Erica left us off, which is maybe not that it's expensive, but it sure as anything isn't free. And you could say the same thing about your financial accounting or your legal diligence or any other part of an investment process. It's not free. There's real work and real time that has to get spent on this, and sometimes it's hiring that, sometimes it's just allocating time, sometimes it's outsourcing it, but if someone isn't putting time, energy, or effort into answering these questions, then I have a hard time understanding how you're going to hold yourself accountable and understand if you've made any progress on the social or environmental benefits that you're seeking. So that's kind of the perspective that I see across the spectrum, because I think as Emily helpfully started to lay out for us, there's a wide range of intensity here of how deep you can go in your understanding, from a academically rigorous, counterfactual, multi-million-dollar, multi-year study to just capturing some very basic administrative data on how the customers are using a certain set of products, to then everything in between. And so I appreciate, Ushnish, the way you put the question, which is about right sizing. How do you put that into context? And so just a couple of snapshots, most of which have good case studies out in the industry, could give you a couple of those examples. You could go to one end of the spectrum, like our colleagues at Root Capital have with their smallholder coffee lending, and they've constructed their own internal, essentially, impact measure to draw an efficient frontier of where should they allocate their capital. Fairly rigorous, very intentional, but they're also seeking soft capital, catalytic capital. So they have to make a case for why they need that type of money. They go fairly deep on that. To go to a different end of the spectrum, and there may be some colleagues here from the fund in the room from Leapfrog, they've gone at a fund level to say, what are the specific population growths of a specific type of service per fund as an a priori target. It's very different, but they have a pretty good sense internally of what they're looking for. To then, one of the clients that I'd referenced of mine, so self-disclosure, Texas Pacific Groups Rise Fund, where they do a quantitative analysis of impact prior to every transaction. And so it's an underwriting process across the 7 sectors that they cover. Fairly resource intensive, but important for their internal integrity, that they can then have KPMG come look and provide assurance on, because that's really what their LPs were looking for. So those are just a few quick snapshots of very different systems that all have internal integrity and were built to fit their purpose. None of them are free, but also none of them are so expensive that they prevent deals from getting done.
Avril, I think you were mentioning something around government now in India looking for evidence, or like, you know, how do they understand impact? If you can give some examples about how that is working with respect to the cost and the amount of money they're ready to spend on trying to understand that. So any examples from there?
I mean, I don't have ready examples right now, but I can share one experience. I mean, we were in discussions with one of the PSUs, Rural Electrification Corporation, REC, and this organization, just for the benefit of the audience who's not aware of REC, what they do is they provide last mile connectivity in terms of electricity connections to the villages, and last mile connectivity to the household in the village. So the main mission is to cover whole of the country and provide electricity, because still there are certain pieces in the country which do not have electricity. So we were having some discussions around impact measurement of this initiative. It's a very large project spread across states, multiple states, hundreds of districts, thousands of villages, and at the end, the end population, which is really the consumers or the households, would run into millions. And now, for such a project, if you were to do impact measurement, obviously cost is the biggest element, because especially if you're trying to do some sort of a quantitative framework and trying to identify what are the outcomes, and then figuring out the impact is humongous. So what we tried doing is we tried first dividing the whole country into states, which is easy. Obviously, states are well defined, into districts, then within districts into villages. Now, the unique part is that there were various factors which required the choice of the sample, because the sample has to represent eventually the population on which you're measuring the impact. So there were various factors which we considered, something like demographics, SECs, percentage of male, females, level of infrastructure, because if the villages had a good level of infrastructure, which means they were more beneficial than the others, off-grid versus on-grid. So the limited point I'm just trying to make is when you actually get down to building the samples, that's when the real, the effort, so to say, emerges in terms of data collection and analysis. And as you want to go further in the sense of getting the right sample, getting the right evidence on that, the cost increases.
Sure. So I think what you pointed out, Avril, is around data collection. So I think we heard in the opening plenary a lot about how in India we are moving to a generation of smartphones, a lot of cell phone penetration, internet penetration. So I think one of the very important things which we have seen in the last decade or so with respect to the cost of impact and management is the fact that the use of technology or the use of like numerous, I would say, startups which have come up on being able to collect data rigorously, but at the same time, you don't have to always go out to the field. I think, Emily, you pointed towards the thing that if it's a product which has been proven, for example, a vaccine, you do not need to redo these sort of things every time, but rather focus on the process and how it's working rather than, whether the final outcome is what you would desire. So, and I think, before I go to Richa, I think if there's anybody in the room who has seen really good technology being used or, which has helped in reduction of cost of understanding impact, any examples you can think of either within your own organization might be very helpful. If anybody has examples, yeah.
We all know what the names are. One of the most successful impact bond in India, extremely well evaluated, has achieved very good success. It's a DIB. To ramp it up, clearly, to take it into an SIB, you need the government to buy into it. Government loved the model. The cost of evaluation was prohibitive. That if you want this to be ramped across, you can't do it with this level of cost of evaluation. What I would like to submit is when you're proving a new model and you need to do certain extra rigor, for example, counterfactuals, etc., I would say that's fine. Like in the case of vaccine, the efficacy of vaccine has been proven through various other counterfactuals. But as you go forward, could you be modelizing this through standard indicators with standard measurement methodologies, with standard OVIs into a tool? I mean, as you know, IRIS is one, but I'm not advocating for the GINS IRIS, which is more of a taxonomy. But I really like Emily's views on this because in India, it's still very early stages. What's the international experience about on this going forward? But now.
Sure. No, thanks, Anil. Sorry, you have a point?
No, because this is now reflecting Anil, but because you mentioned some of the technology that we are using. So in Africa's case, to get some data for the remote villages, sometimes we use SMS, like a text messages. For example, like a data collection is simple question, like have you eaten breakfast? Have you give the food for the children? How many like cows you have? Well, this kind of question, like a yes/no question, is quite easy sometimes to get answer by the SMS. But then sometimes it's help to reduce the cost of the data collection. But still, after the collecting data, lots of analysis, randomized, kind of evaluation, which at the end of the day, it's going to result in the huge cost. But the data collection-wise, we try to get some SMS like a technologies that are still available at the rural area.
Sure. So I think, I mean, even as part of lean data, what I do, our 95 to 97% data collection is through phone. In India, phone works great. In Africa, actually, SMS surveys also work great. And there's such multiple providers who have great technology and very easy to use for data collection. Of course, there's IVR for different purposes. So before I just give it to Emily, I think the important point for all of us to think about is that how do we innovate on reducing these costs but having these in place? And there's, I think, enough evidence now building up that technology is one of the great enablers. So Emily, I'll just like give it to Richa once just to talk about the technology piece driving down costs and how do you see that very prominent in the CSR side?
Sure. So your question here is, suppose if you were setting up a business unit, would you ever question, is impact of the business unit, is it really costly? You would any which ways go ahead and do the impact analysis, whether this business unit works or not, right? So in the beginning, we talked about that how impact is sort of integrated to the overall sustainability of the business, right? So if in true sense, doing good and doing well is integrated, probably this won't even be the question here in the room, right? But I understand because the kind of impact that we're looking at is a lot to do with intangibles. And with technology becoming cheaper and cheaper, it's actually becoming much more easier, to make impact or, to be more integrated into the work that you're doing, So technology is actually changing the whole landscape. Otherwise what, the workers on the ground would do is collect information on paper and pen, and then somebody would get it to a central place. They will do a data entry, and then what in the end we will get is actually good, jazzy looking reports, right? That's not what we are looking at, right? That's not the objective. With technology, and as you said, mobile works great in India, SMS works great in Africa, IVR would work in other regions, so on and so forth. So, and also, a lot of, evolved companies from a CSR perspective, even development funds, they are moving at standardizing certain KPIs for certain sectors, right? So it is becoming all the more easier to sort of, capture data from the ground, also ensure that it is not fudged, because now technology enables you to get the geotag and timestamp of where the data is coming from, right? So you can analyze that this particular data has to come from this place at this particular time so that it becomes difficult for someone to fudge it, right? So you can get robust quality data because the technology is becoming cheaper, and technology is also available in local languages. So it's just not English, right? So it is, it can go to the hands of, multiple users across different geographies, right? So, and that's what we've seen also, in corporate India and other corporates, trying to adopt technology so that they get visibility. And, because there is lack of trust in this sector, in, if I may say that, technology is sort of, bridging that trust deficit. Because the real value of data is getting the data in time rather than, a quarter or 6 months later. It's post-mortem. What would you do of that, right? If you get data more real time, that's when you can take corrective action and you can work as a partner to do things better, right? So all these factors actually are helping in doing better impact measurement, and it's not costly anymore. It used to be, but now it's not, because technology is just becoming so much cheap every day. Yep.
Sorry, I saw two hands. Is this related to this point on technology and impact? No. Sorry, I'll just take that first and then I'll come back. Yes.
So Richa, great point on technology, but let me, there's the flip side to it. And the flip side, I'm talking about the conversations which we were having with the government in terms of, really, first to, erstwhile you asked a question that, are they outcome focused? Clearly, yes. I think the latest conversations with them, Niti Aayog, yes, we want outcomes. Are they, so that answer is yes. The other question is, for example, we at Social Finance India are setting up $1 billion education fund. Now, will we measure? Of course, there's no way anybody's going to give us a penny if you're not measuring the impact. The question is, when you are working with government schools to really, impact millions, do you want to use technology repeat examinations? I think their request from the government is, look, we are doing something across, these exams happen. For example, if you're doing grade 10, I think that's a standard exam which is done across all the schools. Use that. I think there's a way to bring down these transactions costs. The second the way to bring down the transaction cost, which we saw in the bond, which you mentioned, was that's a single transaction, done. If you're creating a fund which, continuously is working on different bonds altogether, there's a way you can leverage these costs. So fund versus a transaction approach will help. And other is, if there is something existing, can we leverage a government examination and consider it fair? It may not be excellent, but just consider it fair.
Sorry, I think we have, I don't know how much time do we have. We have time, okay. So, sorry, I see two more hands. Sorry, Emily, I'll just come back to you.
Just I want to share a few points. First of all, regarding the cost, I've been hearing I'm from NABARD. I'm Amal, a board member in NABARD board. We have been looking at the cost as a kind of something that needs to be factored into in while deciding. I feel that it should be made compulsory. There is no matter. If it is so costly, don't do this. I mean, don't do that activity per se. So the benefit cost analysis has to include this. Second is that I have some worries about the standards that we are talking about, impact, social, environmental, etc. Can we combine all this, because many of these things are overlap. We are concerned with this because just now, by report we are giving the environment, GRI standards, then other standards are there. That apart, cost also be scale related. What scale you are talking about. Also activity related. For example, in NABARD, when we were trying to estimate the kind of benefits of the large scale watershed development programs that we needed to evaluate and then monitor it also, we have used the satellites. We have contracted with the satellite company. They give us every quarter what is the kind of this thing, and from there, rest of the calculations are done. Earlier, we used to take pictures and then post it in this thing, and then GI tag also. In spite of that, it was very expensive and time. The second issue is it will be very, very less expensive if you capture the data as you do it. Don't do this as for the purpose of evaluation. Do it as part of the work process itself, so that you don't need to measure it separately, and it will be available on time. This is also one of our experience. We find that don't go post-mortem and then conduct a study and do it this thing. So data collection is time consuming and also costly. So do it as the process goes by, so that there is not much of incremental cost involved in that. And the last one which I would like to share is that the social cost, we are having this NDS accounting system. I don't know, some of you may be aware. Now the accounting system is being changed. All the NBFCs have to adopt from this year, and the banks have been given 1 more year to change over to the accounting system. This accounting system values 1 million kind of a rupee building as 1.5 million, because they say it is most likely, it is conservative. Different parameters are loss given default, what is the probability, possibility, all these things are included in the accounting system. So when I say 1 million, it is not just 1 million, it is related to something. So can we also think, IFC is there, I think as a community, we should push forward change in the accounting system itself. So all your problems are solved. I will tell you seriously, when all this market related thing can be included in the accounting system, why not this? So just I am throwing this, because you don't count if it is a very harmful to the society, even if they spend 1 million, you count this as only $50.
Sure, sure.
Then
No,
the rest
that's-
of the things are taken care.
No, I love your point about like data being collected in time as part of the process, and I think these are some of the, I would say, dynamic thinking which all of us need to do, and some of us have already started to do, and we see those examples. But I think it's a very, very important point about that dynamism of collection of data. Sorry, Emily, did you want to like respond to a point which Anil had made on the impact bonds?
Impact bonds, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, first of all, I just wanted to note that of all the impact bonds that have been contracted, very few actually have rigorous evaluations or randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental. Only a handful do actually. The majority use validated administrative data. And when I first started doing research on impact bonds, I thought, oh, we're going to see a lot of randomized controlled trials, and I was sort of excited about that thought. But then as I started researching more and understanding more, I came to understand something, which is that at the end of the day, the outcome funders are paying for outcomes, which is much better than so much of what we're doing already, right? So they're paying for outcomes. However, they could be paying too much for outcomes, or they could be paying for outcomes that would have been achieved otherwise in the absence of the intervention, which we can only know if a rigorous evaluation is done. So indeed, the Educate Girls evaluation was quite expensive, but this kind of goes back to the cost-benefit equation because the organization also achieved a lot of insights from having this very rigorous evaluator working closely with them. For example, they had, when they were doing the achievement tests for the students, they were only testing the kids who were at school. The evaluator said, hey, but wait a minute, there are all these kids who are actually not showing up at school, we should test them too. And so, things like that. And the real-time data collection, et cetera, also was a benefit for the organization. So one could say by having this rigorous evaluation, also Educate Girls was then able to demonstrate that they could achieve these outcomes, which may help them fundraise in the future, et cetera. So I'm not saying that you should have rigorous evaluations always and very expensive ones at all, but it's just important to consider what the potential benefits are. But also the scale issue is, if with these outcome funds, potentially those costs could be reduced greatly by having multiple impact bonds at a time. So yeah.
Thank you. So I think sort of one of the points which you mentioned, Emily, is around what you were measuring. So, just not going to measure the learning level outcomes of the children who didn't show up in school was probably one partner's idea. So I think it comes back to the fact that I think different people in this room have different roles. You might be a funder, you might be running an organization, or you might be doing different things. I think the other myth is also that, it's a very top-down approach where, a LP will tell a GP, this is, I've given you money, you have to measure these things, and this is what I require to give it to my board, etc. So is this still a myth, or is this a reality, or has that changed that, the investors or people who are giving the money are still deciding what does impact mean, or, and it's not really the investees or the programs which are running, that they are coming up with the fact that, this is what we feel like is the impact. So I think I would love to hear from Tim, because you work so closely with some of these ISE funds which we have in India, and if you can talk about examples about what you saw as part of your study.
Hey, here are the metrics that we have. We noticed that 2/3 of the IAC members use proprietary metrics, and a lot of the times they are taking from the existing frameworks and then adding their spin, right? India is separate from a lot of the other regions, and so they're adding in some of their own ideas. One of the things that we realized, though, is that there is still a necessity or need for some level of top-down approach, partly because we're talking with one of our respondents, and they said, one of the things we're concerned about in our industry area is that people are just saying that they want to have social impact, but they don't actually care about it. It's just something to put on as a badge of pride. But because there wasn't any accountability to actually measure anything, that they weren't actually providing any of the outcomes that we're really trying to hope to achieve. And so that is one aspect of the top-down approach that can at least still be helpful. And so one of the other things that we realized when we're looking into these different metrics, and I think we were talking about this, about like, can we do standardization? I think, sorry, you were talking about that too. Can we actually talk about across the whole fund, can we say how many lives are we touching? I think Amidyar earlier this morning did a great job saying, hey, we were able to touch this many lives. A report that was done with IAC from McKinsey a couple years back also showed, for example, in certain sectors, we had 30 million lives touched or 5 million lives touched. But when you actually go into, okay, in agriculture, what does that mean? Is it the number of food that I give to a family? Do I count the household as specific people, right? It gets a lot muddier. And so having some sort of standardization could help us actually provide a little bit more accurate numbers to help people actually be able to say, here's the impact that I have, and help them actually get some more money to do more of that measurement.
Thank you, Tim. I'm really sorry, but we have actually run out of time. I'm really sorry. I know there are a lot of you which you had really good points, I'm sure, but I've been told that I need to move the room out. So thank you so much to all our lead discussants and everybody who participated. I know it was a short time, but I hope you took back at least one point which you didn't know when you came in. So yeah, have a good rest of the time. Thank you.